The heavy clouds hung low over Vatican City, their dark bellies brushing the tips of St. Peter's Basilica as if mourning alongside the faithful. The air carried a solemn charge, a weight pressing down upon the tens of thousands who had gathered, cloaked in black, their faces solemn beneath umbrellas and bowed heads. Inside the Grand Basilica, the final preparations were underway. Outside, on the slick cobblestones of St. Peter's Square, the Swiss Guard stood motionless. Every color of their Renaissance uniforms, deep blue, rich red, brilliant yellow, seemed muted under the gray sky, as if the morning had seeped even into the very threads of tradition. Among them, one figure stood slightly apart, not in stance, not in uniform, but in spirit. Corporal Adrian Weiss, 35 years old, 15 years a Swiss Guard, a man known for his precision, his discipline, his unwavering stillness, stood holding more than his halberd that day. Beneath his breastplate, pressed tightly against his heart, was a letter written by Pope Francis himself, given into Adrian's hands by the Pope's own personal secretary 2 nights before. A letter that would force Adrian to make a decision no training manual had ever prepared him for. A decision that would either honor the soul of what he served, or tear down centuries of tradition in front of the entire watching world, and all he had to do was move. Before we reveal what happened next, don't forget to press the subscribe button and comment below where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world. Now let's step back into this extraordinary moment. The morning had begun hours earlier, while the city was still half asleep. Corporal Weiss had risen before the call of the first bell, methodically dressing in the same uniform he had worn for more than a decade, each piece placed with reverence. The blue doublet, the crimson cuffs, the golden braid, the halberd polished until it gleamed. Everything perfect. Everything in its place, just as it should be. And yet, as he adjusted the steel breastplate over his heart, his hand brushed against the hidden envelope, and a tremor he couldn't suppress passed through him. The final request of a dying man. A shepherd asking one last thing of his silent guard. In the privacy of his small room, Adrian had stared at his reflection, at the perfect soldier staring back at him, and wondered whether he could do it, whether he could betray everything he had ever been taught in order to honor something greater. By the time he filed into position that morning, the decision had been made, but the courage to carry it out still burned in his veins like molten iron. As the funeral mass began, a hush fell over St. Peter's Square, unlike anything Adrian had ever experienced. The organ's low, sorrowful tones rolled through the air, vibrating against the stones, against the bones of saints buried deep beneath the ground. The casket appeared at the top of the steps, a simple wooden box, unadorned except for a bronze crucifix atop its lid, just as Francis had requested. The pallbearers moved slowly, their black suits stark against the pale wood. A river of clergy followed, altar servers bearing candles, bishops in violet, cardinals in crimson, their faces solemn and lined. Adrian kept his eyes forward, his muscles locked. But inside, a war raged. Every instinct screamed at him to remain still, to be what he was trained to be, invisible, a living statue. A perfect part of the ceremony. But the letter beneath his armor seemed to burn hotter with every passing second. He remembered the words Francis had spoken to him personally years ago during a quiet meeting in the Papal Gardens, words that had haunted him since. "Adrian," the Pope had said, his voice roughened by age but still vibrant with conviction, "never confuse discipline with obedience. True discipline comes from knowing when to stand and when to kneel." And now the coffin was drawing closer. The faithful leaned forward in their seats. Cameras whirred and clicked. Billions watched across the globe, waiting, expecting. And Adrian Weiss knew. The moment had arrived. The first step echoed louder than any organ note. The heavy heel of his boot cracked against the ancient stone, and instantly heads snapped toward him. Even the rain seemed to pause, suspended in the heavy, gasping silence. The second step, he moved slowly, deliberately, like a man walking through the thick waters of fate itself. Gasps rose from the nearest, rows of mourners. Whispers buzzed at the edges of the crowd like bees disturbed from a hive. The third step. Now he stood before the casket, alone, a single burst of color against the muted sea of black. Without hesitation, Adrian shifted his halberd to his left hand. With his right, he reached into the hidden fold of his armor and withdrew the envelope. The parchment, ivory and plain, seemed to shimmer under the leaden sky. No ornamentation, no seal, only simple, heartfelt words within, the final gift of a man who had always chosen mercy over spectacle. Adrian bent to one knee, the steel plates of his armor creaking softly. With infinite care, he placed the letter atop the coffin, just beneath the bronze crucifix, and in a voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carried by the charged air, he said, "For Ihre letzte Reise." "For your final journey," the words, simple and unadorned, drifted across the stunned square. Somewhere, a woman sobbed quietly. A cardinal froze mid-blessing, his hand trembling in the air, and yet no one moved to stop him. No one dared. In that single act of profound reverence, centuries of rigid expectation cracked, and something softer, something older and deeper, bloomed in its place. Adrian rose. 3 steps back, each one precise, measured, each one a prayer. He returned to his place among the guards, helmet gleaming, halberd vertical. Face composed, but inside he was no longer the same man who had stepped onto the square that morning. He had moved. He had acted. He had fulfilled a promise not just to a man, but to a truth older than the Vatican itself. The funeral continued. The cardinals adjusted their procession. The cameras caught every second, and the world watching understood that something extraordinary had happened, even if they couldn't quite name it. Later, Vatican officials would argue behind closed doors. Some would call for his dismissal. Some would call for silence. A few, in hushed tones, would call it an act of sainthood. But Adrian Weiss didn't hear any of it. He stood where he had always stood, quietly, humbly, faithfully, knowing that sometimes standing still was the greatest act of loyalty, and sometimes moving was. The rest of the funeral mass unfolded with mechanical precision, a ceremony too ancient and too deeply ingrained to falter, even under the weight of an unprecedented moment. But beneath the grand ritual, beneath the sweeping gestures, the clouds of incense, the somber Latin hymns, the atmosphere had shifted. It was subtle, not a disruption, not open chaos, but something had cracked. A tension hummed through the square, an invisible vibration felt in the tight jaws of bishops, in the darting eyes of dignitaries, in the whispering shuffle of feet against slick stones. And at the center of it all stood Corporal Adrian Weiss, a solitary figure burning with a quiet fire no one could extinguish. Hours later, long after the casket had been lowered, after the cardinals had retreated behind ancient stone walls and the tourists had flooded out into the Roman streets, Adrian found himself alone in a small chamber deep beneath the apostolic palace. The walls were bare. The air was thick and still. His halberd had been taken, his sword removed. He wore only the basic uniform now, no armor to shield him, no ceremonial regalia to dignify him. He stood facing a long wooden table. Behind it sat 3 men. Commander Alois Brenner of the Swiss Guard, his face carved from granite. Cardinal Marco de Santis, Secretary for Discipline within the Congregation of Divine Worship. Monsignor Emilio Varelli, a legal mind so sharp his mere presence could slice through the air. They said nothing for a long moment. The silence grew heavier than any sermon. Then Brenner spoke, his voice clipped and cold. "You know why you are here. Corporal Weiss?" "Yes, Commander," Adrian answered steadily. "You moved?" Brenner said, as if stating a crime. "I did?" "You disrupted a sacred ceremony," Cardinal de Santis added, his fingers steepled before him. "Before the eyes of the entire world." Adrian didn't flinch. "I honored a final request," he said simply. Varelli leaned forward, his narrow eyes glittering. You claim the Holy Father instructed you to breach centuries of tradition? That he gave you permission to defy the ceremonial code? Adrian inhaled. Slowly, he didn't command me, he said. He prepared me years ago in private conversation, and through the letter he left for me. You have the letter? Varelli asked sharply. Adrian shook his head. It rests where it belongs, on the coffin. A thin smile curled at the corner of Varelli's mouth, cold and calculating. Convenient, he murmured. Commander Brenner leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, tightly across his chest. You understand, he said, that the Swiss Guard's strength lies not in individual judgment, but in absolute unity. That for over 500 years no guard has broken formation during a papal funeral. I understand, Adrian said, and you chose to break that unity? I chose to uphold a deeper loyalty. Cardinal DeSantis's eyes narrowed. Explain. Adrian met his gaze without hesitation. The Swiss Guard was created to protect the Pope, not just his body, but his soul, his spirit, his mission. Tradition is a tool, not a tomb. When it becomes a cage instead of a shelter, it must be challenged. His voice remained calm, respectful, but beneath it pulsed the steady beat of conviction. For a long moment, none of the men spoke. Brenner's jaw worked silently, as if grinding stones behind his lips. Finally, Varelli closed the folder before him with a soft, deliberate snap. You leave us no easy path, he said. Cardinal DeSantis sighed heavily. We cannot publicly punish you. The optics would be catastrophic. And yet, Brenner said, his voice cold as a winter blade, you cannot continue to stand among the gods at public ceremonies. Your face is too well known, your act too charged. Adrian said nothing. He had known this moment was coming from the instant he had taken that first forbidden step across the square. The sentence was handed down swiftly, permanent reassignment to the Apostolic Archives. A silent exile, not stripped of rank, not dishonored, but hidden, buried among the Vatican's countless relics, a living reminder of the day a Swiss Guard had dared to move. Adrian bowed his head in acknowledgement. Thank you, Commander, Your Eminences. The men offered no farewell. No, blessing only silence. As he turned to leave, Brenner's voice followed him out the door. Pray, Corporal Weiss, that no other guard sees fit to follow your example. The transfer was immediate. Within hours, Adrian found himself descending into the cool, dimly lit halls of the Apostolic Archives, a world apart from the bright ceremonial grandeur above. Gone were the clanging armor drills. Gone the synchronized marches across sunlit courtyards. Gone the polished halberds and gleaming breastplates. Here the only sound was the faint crackle of aging parchment, the whisper of ancient secrets being exhaled slowly into the dust-laden air. His new supervisor, Monsignor Luca Bellini, was a stooped man with ink-stained fingers and an encyclopedic knowledge of forgotten histories. He offered no judgment, no condolences, only a curt nod. You'll patrol the outer corridors, Bellini said. No photography, no pens, only pencils, and no touching the manuscripts without gloves. Adrian accepted his new duties without complaint. He was a soldier still, even if the battlefield had changed, even if the enemies now were time, neglect, and oblivion. Nights fell heavy in the archives. Adrian found solace in the silence. In the company of centuries, he came to know the secret pulse of the place, the way the air shifted subtly before a storm, the faint scent of candle wax that lingered in the oldest chambers, the quiet reverence of scholars who tiptoed among the shelves as if intruding on sacred ground. Here, no one cared that he had moved during the Pope's funeral. No one whispered about the letter. Here, he was simply another guardian, not of tradition, but of memory, of faith, of love. And yet, in the quiet hours, doubt sometimes crept in like mist. Had he truly honored the Pope's wishes? Had he acted out of loyalty or pride? Would history remember him as a servant of the Church, or as a man who had dared to place himself above it? These questions gnawed at him in the darkness, curling around his heart like vines, and still no answers came, only silence, only the endless breathing of history around him. One evening, while inspecting a rarely visited wing of the archives, Adrian stumbled across a small alcove hidden behind a crumbling shelf. Inside was a display case, long forgotten, its glass smeared with dust. Within it, resting on faded velvet, was an ancient letter. The handwriting was careful, ornate. It was a message from a Swiss guard captain during the turbulent days of the Reformation, addressed to his successor. "Never forget that the body we guard is mortal," it read, "but the soul we guard is eternal. Choose wisely when the two are in conflict." Adrian's breath caught in his throat. He pressed his hand against the cold glass. In that moment, the weight of centuries lifted slightly from his shoulders. He wasn't alone. He never had been. He was part of a lineage far older than the rules. A lineage of men who had understood that true loyalty sometimes meant stepping outside the line to protect what truly mattered. Not appearances, not ceremony, but love, faith, the soul itself. And so, in the dim, breathing heart of the apostolic archives, Corporal Adrian Weiss found a new kind of stillness, not the rigid immobility demanded by tradition, but the deeper stillness of a man who had found peace, not by standing motionless, but by moving when it mattered most, and that made all the difference. The apostolic archives were a world apart. Above the ground, the Vatican thrummed with the measured rhythms of faith and tradition. Masses rang out from chapels. Tour groups flowed like rivers through ancient courtyards. The life of the church marched forward, a steady, proud procession of centuries. But down here, beneath thick stone and endless shelves of memory, time stretched and blurred. The archives were silent, save for the soft rustle of parchment and the creaking of old wood. Here, history wasn't a grand procession. It was a whisper, barely clinging to life. Adrian Weiss had quickly learned the unique rhythm of this place. Patrol the corridors with soft steps. Glance into reading rooms where scholars hunched over yellowed pages. Check the sealed vaults that held the most fragile, most sacred relics. Every evening, after his rounds were complete, he would find himself lingering in the quiet chapel, tucked deep in the oldest wing of the archives, a simple space, no marble. No gilded altars, just stone, wood, and a worn crucifix hanging above a rough-hewn altar. Here, Adrian knelt, not to seek forgiveness, not to petition for clarity, but simply to listen for something, anything, that might assure him he had not lost. His way, weeks turned into months. The Vatican above shifted around him. A new pope was elected, full of cautious hope and steady hands. Tourists flooded back into the square, their chatter and cameras once again painting color onto the ancient stones. But no one spoke of the guard who had moved during the funeral, at least not openly. In the archives, he was largely invisible. Monsignor, Bellini gave him steady work but little conversation. The scholars he escorted rarely glanced twice at him. He was, it seemed, destined to become another forgotten figure among millions of forgotten documents. And yet something within Adrian remained fiercely alive. Each day as he patrolled past the great iron vaults and ancient shelves, he traced an invisible thread that ran through every artifact, every letter, every fragile record. A thread of courage, of people who had dared to move, dared to speak, dared to live true to the spirit rather than the letter of the law. He read documents most had forgotten. A note from a medieval monk who defied his abbot to shelter orphans during a famine, a battered journal from a nun who smuggled forbidden texts to the faithful during the darkest days of the Inquisition, a torn parchment from a guard centuries ago confessing that he had once disobeyed orders to save a dying pilgrim. Their words echoed across time, reaching out to him like distant stars. "You are not alone," they seemed to say. "You never were." One rainy afternoon, while reviewing patrol routes near a restricted section of the archives, Adrian heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. He turned. It was a boy, maybe 10, maybe 11 years old. Dark hair clung damply to his forehead. He wore a simple school uniform and clutched a worn leather satchel tightly against his chest. Adrian frowned slightly. No visitors were allowed back here without authorization. He approached carefully, lowering himself to the boy's eye level. "Lost?" he asked gently. The boy nodded miserably. "I was with my class," he said, his Italian tinged with a Roman accent. "I wanted to see the old maps, but I turned the wrong way." Adrian smiled softly. "Easy mistake to make," he said. "Come on, let's find your teacher." As they walked slowly through the endless corridors, the boy kept sneaking glances up at him. Finally, he blurted, "You're the guard who moved, aren't you?" Adrian stopped. The boy froze, shrinking slightly as if expecting to be scolded. "People still talk about it," the boy said hurriedly. "At my school, some say you broke the rules. Others say you saved something important." Adrian considered this carefully. "What do you think?" he asked. The boy hesitated, kicking at a crack in the stone floor. "I think sometimes the rules don't see everything," he said finally. "But maybe people do." Adrian felt a lump form in his throat. He crouched down so they were eye level again. "Rules are important," he said, "but so is remembering what they're meant to protect." The boy nodded seriously, like protecting the heart, not just the hands. Adrian smiled then, a real unguarded smile that felt like sunlight after a long, cold winter. "Exactly," he said. He delivered the boy safely back to his frantic teacher, waving away the flurry of thanks with a small nod. But something stayed with him long after the boy had disappeared into the crowd. Something lighter, something warmer, reminder. That evening he returned to the archive chapel. He knelt once more before the worn crucifix, but this time he did not kneel as a man seeking absolution. He knelt as a man giving thanks for the journey, for the burden, for the chance to remember who he was and who he had been called to be. He lit a candle, placing it on the rough stone altar, not for himself, but for all those across the centuries who had dared to move when standing still would have been easier. He sat in the quiet long after the flame had flickered out, listening, breathing, at peace. In the weeks that followed, something changed subtly in Adrian's bearing. He still wore the plain black uniform, still patrolled the same silent corridors, still nodded respectfully to scholars and priests, but inside, a new steadiness had taken root. He was no longer hiding, no longer carrying his choice like a shameful secret. He carried it like a badge, invisible to all but the ones who mattered. And though most days passed without incident, without acknowledgement, there were moments, small, precious moments, when the truth would break through. A respectful nod from an old Monsignor who had once sat in judgment. A small cross traced in the air by a scholar in passing. A simple whispered thank you from a young novice guarding a trembling faith. Little signs that someone somewhere still remembered, still understood, still honored what had been done. Adrian knew he would never return to the pomp and ceremony of public service. He would never stand on the sunlit stones of St. Peter's Square again, halberd gleaming, posture perfect. That chapter had closed, but he had found something richer among the crumbling manuscripts and forgotten parchments, a deeper loyalty. A truer service, not to spectacle, not to tradition for its own sake, but to the soul beneath it all, the soul that dared to love more than it feared, the soul that dared to move. And in that silent, sacred service, Adrian Weiss found his place, not as a statue, but as a man, alive, faithful, free. The seasons turned in the eternal city, and with them, so too did the slow, invisible tides of the Vatican. Above ground, pilgrims continued to flood the square, snapping photos and murmuring prayers. Cardinals and diplomats crossed marble halls, discussing matters of faith and policy in hushed, urgent tones. The church, as it always had, moved forward, and beneath it all, in the cool, breathing heart of the apostolic archives, Adrian Weiss continued his quiet vigil. He had become, over time, something of a fixture, a silent, steady presence among the ancient scrolls and crumbling parchments. A man others glanced at, nodded to, but rarely approached. There were newer guards now who barely knew his name, and older scholars who spoke of him only in whispers, the man who had moved once when all others stood still. But Adrian had no need for their recognition. His purpose was not to be seen. It was to serve, not the letter of tradition alone, but the spirit it was meant to protect, and he did so faithfully, every day, without complaint. One cold winter afternoon, as he patrolled the restricted vaults, Adrian noticed a figure standing by one of the ancient display cases. A young priest, no older than 25, was peering intently at a document. Behind glass, Adrian approached silently at first, prepared to remind him of the rules. But something in the priest's expression stopped him. There was wonder there, reverence, longing. Is this real?" the priest asked softly, not turning. Adrian followed his gaze. Inside the case, protected by thick glass and careful lighting, was a battered letter from the earliest days of the church, written by an unknown disciple, pleading for courage in a time of persecution. "It's real?" Adrian said quietly. The priest turned, studying him. "You're the one who placed the letter on the coffin," he said. It wasn't a question. Adrian said nothing. He didn't need to. The priest smiled faintly. "My father told me about you," he said. "He said sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is to choose the soul over the shield." Adrian's chest tightened. He nodded once, sharply, and the young priest, understanding that no more words were needed, bowed respectfully and walked away. Long after the priest had gone, Adrian remained standing before the case. He read again. The ancient words behind the glass. "Lord, grant me the courage to move when stillness tempts me to silence." He closed his eyes, breathing the words deep into his bones. They had crossed centuries to find him. They had crossed centuries because some things, some truths, are too powerful to be buried. Later that evening, as Adrian walked the dim corridors, back to his quarters, he paused before the old archive chapel. The door creaked open under his hand, revealing the familiar worn altar and the solitary crucifix above it. He stepped inside, shedding the weight of duty from his shoulders. Kneeling before the altar, he whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for remembrance, for the strength to continue carrying the flame that had once flickered in the trembling hand of a dying pope. The flame that had passed to him, and that he now carried forward, not in grand parades or shining armor, but in silent, unseen faithfulness, in the place where it mattered most. Years later, when new crises gripped the church and new heroes rose and fell in the world's eye, the story of the Swiss Guard who moved during Pope Francis's funeral became a legend. It wasn't taught in the official tours, it wasn't inscribed in golden letters on the basilica walls, but in quiet corners of the Vatican, among the guards who trained their feet to stillness and their hearts to vigilance, Adrian's name was whispered with respect. Not because he had disobeyed, but because he had remembered what their service was truly for. Because he had moved, not for glory, but for love. And on the rarest of days, when the square was empty and the mist clung low to the stones, a visitor might glimpse a solitary figure in black walking slowly across the plaza. Not a tourist, not a priest, but a guardian of memory, a man who had once dared to move when the whole world demanded he stand still, a man who had understood that true loyalty, the kind that outlasts centuries, belongs not to ritual alone. It belongs to the soul. Was Adrian right to move at such a sacred and solemn moment? Can true loyalty sometimes mean stepping beyond the rules we swore to uphold? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. Faith, after all, is not built on silence alone. It is shaped by courage. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button, subscribe, and tap the bell icon, so you never miss another true story that reveals the hidden acts of love and bravery that shape our world. Check out our next story now appearing on your screen, and join us for another journey into the quiet courage that still lives among us.